The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Dr. James Jones, author of In the Middle of This Road We Call Our Life, The Courage to Search for Something More. I'm Eileen Cavanaugh from the Hennepin County Library Program Office, and my guest today, James Jones, is the professor of religion at Rutgers University and has been in private practice as a psychotherapist for 15 years. Welcome to the program, Dr. Jones.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Good to have you in cold Minnesota
Indeed.
April weather.
That's how I know I'm in Minnesota, right?
You used, for the title of your book, a quote from the great spiritual journeyer Dante's Inferno. Dante maybe had a midlife crisis too, which is something you talk about in your book.
Well, the title really conveys, or the Inferno really conveys the sense of how much struggle is involved in a spiritual path, and that's why the subtitle of the book is The Courage to Search for Something More, because it really does take courage. It's not, I mean, I think sometimes these days people are looking for sort of shake and bake spirituality. They're going to add water and they're going to be enlightened in 2 weeks, and if it doesn't work, then they give it up. And in fact, it's a very courageous thing to undertake a spiritual journey. And so part of the reason why I thought Dante's Inferno was a sort of appropriate metaphor for what the book was about was because here's a person who obviously went through a great deal of struggle in the course of his spiritual path.
And it's interesting that he went to hell first.
Yes, yes.
Before he went on to better things.
Well, I think one has to confront the darker side. Carl Jung, who's not somebody I quote a lot, said something very wise once. He said, you don't become enlightened by meditating on light, you become enlightened by dealing with the shadow. And by the shadow, he meant all those things in ourselves that we don't want to look at. And that's why it takes courage, because it means looking at parts of ourselves, oftentimes means looking at parts of ourselves that we don't really want to look at, and it's hard to face.
I think you do quote him too later on in the book, saying that he never met a person over 35 whose problems weren't solved by spiritual answers.
Yes, that's right. And that's in a sense what the book is about, how important it is to take seriously those spiritual questions when they arise. And in this culture, of course, we don't do that. In this culture, we satirize those things. You know, Woody Allen gets a lot of mileage out of making fun of people who walk around saying, what is the meaning of life? And we don't take those questions particularly seriously. And we teach people in this culture that they really ought to be satisfied if they collect a few toys and have a great love life, and everything ought to be fine. And then when people reach a point in their life where they realize that's not true, when they maybe they are reasonably successful in the world and things are going really well, and they still wake up in the middle of the night saying, well, gee, what is this all about? And is there a meaning? And is there a purpose to all of this? And they feel, and I see this with patients, and this is really a book that came out of listening to patients. People feel a certain amount of guilt and shame because they say, geez, what's wrong with me? There must be something wrong with me, that I'm still dissatisfied even though I am reasonably successful, and there must be something wrong with me. And
well, in a lot of your patient stories, it seems as if people who had prestigious jobs and high-paying jobs ended up, after they went through this kind of inferno experience, taking jobs that were more satisfying but perhaps paying less. For instance, Tom, the doctor who has a lucrative practice and decides he wants to be an actor, but he can't earn a living being an actor. And so he sort of compromises by taking part in community theater, but ending up having the practice where a holistic kind of practice where he spends some time with people and gets some personal satisfaction, and undoubtedly his patients get some satisfaction.
Exactly, no, that's right.
So it almost seems as if there's an intersection sometimes between a job that is unfulfilling and a marriage that's in trouble. Is this the kind of thing that causes people often to go on a spiritual search?
Well, I think it is, and again, I think some of this is cultural. I mean, you referred earlier to sort of midlife issues, and it isn't only a midlife thing. I mean, I teach students at the university, at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and we're talking about people in their late adolescence, early 20s. Tremendous interest in religious and spiritual topics. All of our courses are full, and it's not just where I am. I talk to my colleagues around the country, and they all say the same thing. But I think, as I said, in this culture, we sort of teach people not to take these questions seriously. We teach them that they're not important. And also we provide a certain amount of anesthesia that keeps people from really taking these questions seriously. I mean, a person may say, oh my heavens, I'm having a serious thought about my life. I'd better pour myself a drink or buy myself a gimmick, or, we have all kinds of ways of anesthetizing ourselves. So I think what happens is that people put these questions off, and then it really takes a crisis down the road to get through to them. I don't think there has to be a crisis, but I think in this culture we sort of make it into a crisis because people put it off and put off dealing with these spiritual questions, these questions of meaning and purpose. And then they put them off, and then there has to be some real crisis, the loss of a job or the breakup of a relationship or some real crisis that then sort of wakes them up and says, oh my heavens, I better take a look at my life. And so I think that's why this is often associated with a crisis. It's the same kind of things that bring people into psychotherapy. That it sometimes takes a crisis to get through to them. I don't think that's essential, but I think it often happens that way because of the culture.
So, in a sense, consumerism and materialism could be called enemies of the spirit.
Well, I think that's too strong. I mean, I think I was sort of talking about the American culture. I mean, in North American culture, I don't think there's anything wrong. I don't want to be misunderstood about this. I don't think there's anything wrong with being successful or having a good family life. I think that's wonderful. But in this culture, we ask them to do a job that's not theirs to do. We ask them to give us a sense of ultimate meaning and ultimate fulfillment, and that they can't do. And in this culture, we try to wring every last drop of meaning out of our jobs or out of our relationships, and that's asking too much of them. I don't think they're enemies at all of the spiritual life, but I think they need to be put in a larger context, and I think that's part of what Spiritual Path does. It connects your individual self to some larger spiritual reality, and so that we don't try to get ultimate fulfillment out of our relationships or out of our jobs. But obviously, I don't think there's anything wrong with being successful in your job or successful in your relationships. But I mean, this is really about what does it mean to be a human being. I mean, we have a physical part, a biological part. In this culture, we take pretty good care of that for most people. And we have a psychological part, and at least many people in this culture sort of attend to that. But we also have a spiritual part, and what I'm saying is we don't pay much attention to that. So that's why a person can be reasonably successful in the material, physical world, and can be reasonably healthy psychologically. They can communicate with their significant other, and they can get in and out of the room without turning the light switch off 10 or 12 times, and still have questions about the meaning and purpose and value of their life, because those are really spiritual questions, and they're not attending to that.
I'm thinking back to my own youth and adolescence where it seemed to me there was religion, there was going to church on Sunday, and there was attention to that. But in my view, back then, spirituality was a whole different thing. It was not very closely related for me to religion. I thought of spirituality as something that the priests and the nuns attended to.
Oh, I see.
And not me.
Yeah.
So is that changing among young people today?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I say in the book, and I make a distinction, which a lot of people make, between religion and spirituality. It's a little different than your distinction. What I mean by religion is the institutional aspects, the buildings, the hierarchy, the doctrine, the moral teaching. By spirituality, I mean the experience, and that's how I sort of get into it as a psychologist, because psychologists are interested in experience. And the experience that your individual life is connected to or related to or a part of some larger spiritual reality that gives your life meaning and purpose. And I think if you look at the sociology of this, what you see is from, say, 1950 to the present, there's been, on any measure, there's been a tremendous decline in the institutional strength of the mainstream religious institutions in this country. At the same time, there's been an increase in the number of people who say they believe in God or some higher power, who say they pray or meditate or engage in some spiritual discipline every day, who buy religious books, who attend weekend workshops and seminars on religion. There's tremendous interest in this culture. Oftentimes the sort of spokespersons for mainstream institutions say, oh, the society's so secular, there's no interest in these things. That's simply not true. I mean, or the number of students that sign up for religious studies courses in universities. Tremendous interest out there. We live in a sort of unchurched and unsynagogued culture, but we don't live in an unreligious culture. And I think what all that, there's a lot of reasons for this, but I think what all that the statistics show is that there's a tremendous interest, but it's taking place outside of the institutional walls of mainstream religious institutions.
And that's got to be kind of bad news for the people who are inside the walls.
It is bad news. It is bad news. And oftentimes they don't want to hear it. They'd rather think, well, the problem is that the society is so secular that people aren't interested. Fact is, people are tremendously interested. But the interest, for all kinds of reasons, the interest is taking place, by and large, outside of the walls of these institutions.
But I'm thinking that part of the fault that lies with institutional religion is that they haven't really encouraged people to find their own adult spirituality. In many cases, I think they've kept them chained to ritual and dogma and practice that maybe people have outgrown or no longer can connect with.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's basically three reasons why this is happening, and that's one of them. That we value, and I think this is good. In this culture, we value a certain amount of individuality and autonomy and people discovering a path for themselves. And I think that's right. I'm very suspicious of these sort of master-disciple relationships where people go to somebody and say, tell me what's the meaning of my life or something like that. Because I'm not just me personally, but psychologists, people in my position, are the people who pick up the pieces psychologically when those things don't work out. So one of the things I really stress in this book are tools for finding your own spiritual path. I mean, you know, people are different. We're talking about a God that doesn't even make two snowflakes alike, you know, so people are different. And I think it's very important that, as my kids used to say, you know, I don't put my trip on somebody else's head. You know, I don't say, you have to undertake the same spiritual path that I do. And I think that's one of the reasons why people are looking outside of institutions, is because people really have come to value, I think rightly, having a faith of their own, a spiritual path of their own. And and religious institutions, as you said, but to put it mildly, have been very slow to embrace the values of individual freedom and autonomy, so on and so forth. I think another reason is because we're talking about an age cohort of people who are, for all kinds of reasons, good reasons, very suspicious of institutions. It's not only religious institutions, it's political institutions and educational institutions. So it makes sense that when they come to undertake a spiritual path, it's going to have a certain non- or anti-institutional flavor to it.
The 1994 elections certainly.
Yeah, well, and I think, you know, I think there's just, you know, people are very anti-institutional and suspicious of institutions with good reason. I think the third reason has to do with pluralism, that people know that we live in one world spiritually. I mean, you can go down to your local bookstore or probably your local library, and you can find the sacred texts of religious traditions that your parents didn't even know existed. And you can take them home and you can read them, or you can come to university and you can take a course in world religions. And so the average person is aware of the existence of other religious traditions other than the ones that they belong to. And again, mainstream religious institutions have been very slow to catch up with the reality that there are other religions besides their own. And so I think another reason why people are looking for things outside of institutional boundaries is because they want a spirituality that takes account of pluralism. They want a spirituality that makes sense of the fact that we live in one world spiritually. And I think it's basically for those three reasons that this tremendous spiritual interest is being channeled outside of the mainstream religious institutions.
So that in response to your third part, there does seem to be a trend toward the blending of religions, especially the Eastern and Western traditions.
Oh, I think that's right. I think that's right. And it's not just sort of dilettantism. I mean, you know, it goes on at very serious levels. I mean, certainly I see this in universities in terms of students from different traditions who make a real study of other religious traditions. I know, for example, of a group of Roman Catholic monastics and Zen Buddhist monastics who are spending together a month in each other's monastery to really learn something of their other spiritual paths. And so it's not just some people say, oh, this is just kind of cafeteria spirituality, take a little piece of Zen Buddhism, a little piece of Catholicism, a little piece of Native American traditions. And I'm sure that there is some of that sort of superficial shopping around. But I think it also goes much deeper than that, because I think it really is people looking for a spirituality that really does take pluralism seriously.
Well, even Thomas Merton, who was a
Absolutely.
well-respected
Absolutely.
Roman Catholic
Absolutely.
monk, was
Went to
at the end of
Tibet.
his
Right.
life looking into this, which is it is kind of interesting metaphorically that
Yeah.
it was at the very end
Yeah,
of his life
yeah,
that
yeah, exactly.
did that.
And there are Tibetan, I mean, sometimes I say jokingly there are more Tibetan lamas in California than there are in Tibet. That's not totally true, and part of that has to do with the political policy of the Chinese government. But still, you know, these men and to some extent women are over in this country learning Western philosophy, learning Western science, learning Western psychology. Tibetan Buddhism will never be the same. Even if the policy of the Chinese government changed and all these people went back to Tibet, they would bring with them their experience of living in the West and taking a part of Western philosophy and religion and culture. So there definitely is this interpenetration. But again, it's going on more outside of the sort of mainstream institutions than inside of them.
It's interesting that you say that, because I think Americans tend to think that they're more changed by the influence of the East and fail to think about perhaps the East as being changed by the influence
Oh,
of
it
the
is.
West
Oh, there's
as
no
well.
question. That's true.
As well. I'm thinking about some older people in the 60s who were raised under that sort of punishing mode of religion in their early lives, and yet this is the time in their life when they may be on a serious spiritual quest. Are they also looking for their spirituality outside of religion? It seems that older people are often wed to the religion in which they were raised, but often it wasn't a good experience for them.
I'm not sure what you mean by older people. I mean, you mean people after retirement?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's a good question, and I'm not feeling very sure-footed about the answer, because I really don't, I don't really know a lot of research on, on people, in that age cohort. So I'm actually I'm a little reluctant to speak, because
Okay.
I don't like to shoot from the hip, and being a psychologist, I'm sort of, feel like I need to refer to the, the research and so on and so forth. I'm not sure. One of the things I do know is that if we're talking about a somewhat younger age cohort, that is the people, say, late 30s, 40s, early 50s, in the past, the sort of cycle was that people would sort of be raised, people would be raised in a church or a synagogue, and they would go until they were confirmed or bar mitzvahed or something like that, and then they would drop out. And so you had, people were involved sort of up to 12, 13, 14, 15. Then in sort of late adolescence, early 20s, bang, they dropped out, very low percentage of people. And then these people would get married and have kids, and then they would come back. And certainly that was the pattern in the 50s. I mean, if you looked at the churches and synagogues that were built in the 50s, they were basically Hebrew schools or Sunday schools with a sanctuary attached. I mean, it was a very child-centered kind of thing. And so people would return when they had children of, school age, elementary school age children. And one of the things that is happening to the age cohort, say 35 to 50 or something like that, is they are returning to some extent to religious institutions, but nowhere near, even though they now have children in that, nowhere near in the same numbers as people returned in earlier generations. So one might extrapolate from that. I don't know, because it's a guess, and I'm a psychologist and not a prophet, but one might extrapolate that pattern would continue throughout, because these people are, so that even as they get a sort of older post-retirement age, they may not be returning to institutions at the mainstream institutions, because that very deep-seated anti-institutionalism remains. The other thing is, I mean, I think we sometimes think about this, and it's sometimes portrayed in the press, is it's sort of these two options. Either you're this sort of isolated individual trying to make up a spiritual path on your own, or you sign your life away to some church or synagogue forever. And in fact, something else that's going on that people don't pay much attention to is that there are all sorts of parallel institutions that are being developed. For example, weekend conferences and seminars. The tremendous proliferation of weekend conferences and seminars on religious and spiritual themes, so that people who may not be up for, who are anti-institutional enough that they may not be up for making a commitment to a church or a synagogue for the rest of their life, will make a commitment to go to a seminar for the weekend or go on a week retreat. So, and there's some sense of community, and they'll go for a week or a weekend and get something and then think about it for a while, and then they'll come back and do another seminar. That's a sort of parallel institution. Same thing is true of study groups in people's homes, which again, sociologists don't pay much attention to. It's easier to go down and count the membership rolls at the local Methodist church than it is to try to get a hold of how many people are going to weekend conferences and seminars, or how many people are involved in sort of living room discussions. But there are a tremendous number of these. Women's spirituality, for example. There's a tremendous number of women's spirituality groups meeting in people's houses. They never show up anywhere. They're never counted on any survey. Groups that have to do with alternative forms of healing. Another example. Again, they don't show up anywhere. Nobody counts them. They don't have membership lists and so on and so forth.
Or even support groups.
And support groups with a spiritual emphasis. 12-step groups that talk about a higher power. So they're all what I'm calling sort of parallel or alternative institutions, I think, so that people aren't just either totally isolated on their own or sort of signing up forever to some mainstream religious institution.
So we almost have a new movement of many sort of semi-spiritual or semi-religious kinds of institutions.
I think that's right.
In other words, we have more options to offer people in their search for spirituality.
There's no doubt we do. As I say, so in terms of the publication of religious books, as I say, you can have access to the texts of religious traditions that people didn't even know existed 50 years ago. And I mean, if you sort of think about sort of pre-modern, this is very oversimplified, but if you sort of think about sort of pre-modern culture as being a time when when spiritual values were very salient in the culture, but there wasn't much, to put it mildly, there wasn't much respect for individual freedom and autonomy. And then you sort of have the modern period in which there's tremendous emphasis on individuality and individual freedom and choice. But the spiritual values tend to really take a far, far back seat. And I think part of what all of this ferment is about is people struggling to recover that sense of the importance of the spiritual life, the importance of spiritual values and a spiritual outlook and religious experience, but in a way that is respectful of individual autonomy. That's why it's not going back to the sort of authoritarian religions of the past. It's trying to find a spirituality that respects individual autonomy and freedom, but yet also takes spirituality seriously in a way that modern culture, which respected individual autonomy and freedom, did not take spirituality seriously.
You made a point in the book about talking about the divine aspect of our real selves, and I was thinking that it's difficult for us as human beings to look at our own flaws. But I was also thinking that it's even more difficult to say that, yes, there is a divine aspect of myself.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's hard to believe that there's that goodness within
Yes,
it.
exactly.
It's even harder to believe about the goodness in us than it is to believe about the flaws within us. And it seems to me that your theory in the book is to say that the search for meaning is accessed through that divine self, but we have to believe in it and be able to access it.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's exactly right. And if people, again, thinking about it psychologically, I mean, if people grow up in an environment where there's a tremendous emphasis on guilt or shame or criticism, or that's punitive in some way, or is sort of detached, and there's not a lot of involvement, emotional involvement in the life of the growing young person, then the person grows up feeling that there's something wrong with them, or they grow up in a way. I mean, our view of ourself, we learn. I mean, it's a mirroring thing, and how we are, how we're reflected back to us from the people around us is how we see ourselves. So if we grow up in an environment which has a lot of guilt or shame or punishment or not taking us seriously or ignoring us or something like that, then that's how we're going to treat ourselves, and we're going to develop a sense of this is what I call the false self, that sense of ourself as that we're a bad person, there's something wrong with us, we can't do anything right, nobody's going to, all of that. And if you have that sort of false self orientation about yourself, then there's tremendous amount of guilt and shame in believing or in thinking that there may be a soul or a spirit or the image of God or the Buddha nature or the Brahman and the Atman. You know, it's talked about in different ways in different religious traditions, but it's one thing that all the religions of man and womankind agree on, is that there is within all of us some, as Plato says, window on the eternal, some soul or spirit or Buddha nature or something which is akin to, which is sacred, which is akin to the divine or the transcendent or the sacred. And it seems to me what a spiritual path does, among other things, is help us uncover that. But those sort of false self views of ourself get in the way and make it, you're right, that people feel a lot of, and I see this with patients, people feel a lot of guilt and shame if they start to think, geez, maybe I do have this sort of spark of the divine in me.
And in this long process where people have developed the so-called false self to cope with all of this,
Exactly.
There's also, I assume, a process of getting rid of that, which
Yes.
can be pretty painful
Yes,
too.
exactly. And that's really,
You've spent your life
yes, right, helping people do
comfortable
that.
with it.
Helping people do that, exactly. I mean, that's really what psychotherapy is about, it seems to me, is breaking through those obstacles that constitute the false self and sort of recovering the true self. Somebody, I wish I'd said it, it's a great quote. Somebody said, the task of therapy is to introduce the patient to him or herself, you know. And I think
To
that's
his
right.
real self.
Yeah, to
Yes,
his real self,
yes,
exactly.
yes.
Yeah.
Poor people and mentally ill people are often groups that are most in need of finding their real selves, or certainly finding that divine seed within them. And yet they're the very people that probably have the least access to spiritual direction and probably even psychological help. What happens with people like that?
Well, if they're fortunate, they will find their way, and this is for all kinds of social and political and economic reasons much more difficult. They will find their way into some environment that provides some social support. I mean, one of the things that's true of people on the average, particularly people who are mentally ill or people who've been substance abusers, for example, is they need a lot more of a structured environment than somebody who, you know, they're a little bit disorganized and they need a certain amount of a structured environment. And so, you know, what they need to find their way to some, it may be a church thing, it may be a 12-step program, it may be a clinic, something.
Again, the alternative programs.
Yes, yes, exactly. And I think one of the things that certainly is true, at least in some poor communities in this culture, is that the church remains a very important pillar of their social and psychological life, because it is a place where they do, in the best of all worlds, where there is a sense of social support, where there is a sense of caring, where there is a sense of compassion, where there is a sense of community.
And we've come to that place where we're out of time, and I wish we could talk longer, because the book is a wonderful readable book, and I certainly recommend it. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.